Let's continue with the sixth chapter of Mary Poppins Comes Back, Robertson A's story. While Michael was playing in the park, pretending to be king of the castle, he saw the dirty rascal, and now Mary Poppins is telling the story of the dirty rascal. And it begins with a king who could not learn any wisdom. And we will pick up from there. Then, because he could not go on weeping forever, he wiped his eyes and leant back in his golden chair, and as he did that, he gave a little start of surprise, for a stranger had pushed past the sentry at the gate and was walking up the path that led to the castle. "Hullo," said the king. "Who are you?" For he had no memory for faces. "Well, if it comes to that," replied the stranger, "who are you?" "I'm the king of the castle," said the king, picking up the bent scepter and trying to look important. "And I'm the dirty rascal," was the reply. The king opened his eyes wide with astonishment. "Are you really, though? That's interesting. I'm very pleased to meet you. Do you know 7 times 7? "No, why should I?" At that, the king gave a great cry of delight, and running down the steps, embraced the stranger. At last, cried the king. "I have found a friend. You shall live with me. What is mine shall be yours. We shall spend our lives together." "But, Ethelbert," protested the queen, "this is only a common person. You cannot have him here." "Your Majesty," said the Lord High Chancellor sternly, "it would not do." But for once the king defied him. "It would do very nicely," he said royally. "Who is king here, you or I? Well, of course, in a manner of speaking, you are, as it were, your Majesty, but very well. Put this man in cap and bells, and he can be my fool." "Fool!" cried the queen, wringing her hands. "Do we need any more of these?" But the king did not answer. He flung his arm round the stranger's neck, and the two went dancing to the castle door. "You first," said the king politely. "No, you," said the stranger. "Both together, then," said the king generously. And they went in side by side. And from that day the king made no attempt to learn his lessons. He made a pile of all his books and burnt them in the courtyard, while he and his new friend danced round it, singing, "I'm the king of the castle, and you're the dirty rascal." For that was the only... "Is that the only song you can sing?" asked the fool one day. "Yes, I'm afraid it is," said the king rather sadly. "Do you know any others?" "Oh dear, yes," said the fool, and he sang sweetly, "Bright, bright, be in your flight, drop down some honey for supper tonight." And sweet and low over the snow the lolloping, scalloping lobsters go. Did you know? And boys and girls come out to play over the hills and far away. The sheep's in the meadow, the cow's in the stall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. "Lovely!" cried the king, clapping his hands. "Now listen, I've just thought of one myself. It goes like this. All dogs, tiddly-dum, hate frogs, tiddly-do." Said the fool. "Not bad." "Wait a minute," said the king. "I've thought of another, and I think it's a better one. Listen carefully." And he sang, "Pluck me a flower and catch me a star, and braise them in butter and treacle and tar. Tra-la, how delicious they are." "Bravo!" cried the fool. "Let's sing it together." And he and the king went dancing through the castle, chanting the king's 2 songs, one after the other, to a very special tune. And when they were tired of singing, they fell together in a heap in the main corridor, and there went to sleep. "He gets worse and worse," said the queen to the Lord High Chancellor. "What are we to do?" "I have just heard," replied the Lord High Chancellor, "that the wisest man in the kingdom, the chief of all the professors, is coming tomorrow. Perhaps he will help us." And the next day the chief professor arrived, walking smartly up the path to the castle, carrying a little black bag. It was raining slightly, but the whole court had gathered at the top of the steps to welcome him. "Has he got his wisdom in that little bag, do you think?" whispered the king. But the fool, who was playing knuckle-bones beside the throne, only smiled and went on tossing. Now, if your Majesty pleases," said the chief professor in a business-like voice, "let us take arithmetic first. Can your Majesty answer this? If 2 men and a boy were wheeling a barrow over a clover field in the middle of February, how many legs would they have between them?" The king gazed at him for a moment, rubbing his scepter against his cheek. The fool tossed a knuckle-bone and caught it neatly on the back of his wrist. "Does it matter?" said the king, smiling pleasantly. The chief professor started violently and looked at the king in astonishment. "As a matter of fact," he said quietly, "it doesn't. But I will ask your majesty another question. How deep is the sea? Deep enough to sail a ship on?" Again the chief professor started, and his long beard quivered. He was smiling. "What's the difference, majesty, between a star, a stone, a bird, and a man?" "No difference at all, professor. A stone is a star that shines not, and a man is a bird without wings." The chief professor drew nearer and gazed wonderingly at the king. "What is the best thing in the world?" he asked quietly. "Doing nothing," answered the king, waving his bent scepter. Oh, dear," wailed the queen. "This is dreadful," said the Lord High Chancellor. But the chief professor ran up the steps and stood by the king's throne. "Who taught you these things, majesty?" he demanded. The king pointed with his scepter to the fool who was throwing up his knuckle bones. Said the king. "Him," said the king, ungrammatically. The chief professor raised his bushy eyebrows. The fool looked up at him and smiled. He tossed a knuckle bone, and the professor, bending forward, caught it on the back of his hand. "Ha!" he cried. "I know you, even in the cap and bells. I know the dirty rascal." "Ha! Laughed the fool. "What else did he teach you, majesty?" The chief professor turned again to the king. "To sing," answered the king. And he stood up and sang, "A black and white cow sat up in a tree, and if I was she, then I shouldn't be me." "Very true," said the chief professor. "What else?" The king sang again in a pleasant, quavering voice. "The earth spins round without a tilt, so that the sea shall not be spilt." "So it does," remarked the chief professor. "Any more?" "Oh, gracious, yes," said the king, delighted in his success. "There is this one. Oh, I could learn and tell I'm pink, but then I'd have no time to think. Or perhaps, professor, you'd prefer, we won't go round the world, for then we'd only come back home again." The chief professor clapped his hands. "There's one more," said the king, "if you'd care to hear it." "Please, sing it, sire." And the king cocked his head at the fool and smiled wickedly and sang, "Chief professors should all be drowned in early infancy." At the end of the song, the chief professor gave a loud laugh and fell at the king's feet. "O king," he said, "live forever. You shall have no need of me." And without another word, he ran down the steps and took off his overcoat and waistcoat. Then he flung himself down upon the grass and called for a plate of strawberries and cream and a large glass of beer. Said the horrified Lord Chancellor, for now all the courtiers were rushing down the steps and taking off their coats and rolling in the rainy grass. "Strawberries and beer! Strawberries and beer!" they shouted thirstily. "Give him the prize!" said the chief professor, sucking his beer through a straw and nodding in the direction of the fool. "Pooh!" said the fool. "I don't want it. What would I do with it?" And he scrambled to his feet, put his knuckle bones in his pocket, and strolled off down the path. "Hi! Where are you going?" cried the king anxiously. "Oh, anywhere, everywhere," said the fool airily, sauntering on down the path. "Wait for me! Wait for me!" called the king, stumbling after his train as he hurried down the steps. "Ethelbert, what are you doing? You forget yourself!" cried the queen angrily. "I do not, my dear," the king called back. "On the contrary, I am remembering myself for the first time." He hurried down the path, caught up with the fool, and embraced him. "Ethelbert!" called the queen again. The king took no notice. The rain had ceased, but there was still a watery brightness in the air, and presently a rainbow streamed out of the sun and curved in a great arc down to the castle path. "I thought we might take this road," said the fool, pointing. "What? The rainbow? Is it solid enough? Will it hold us? Try." The king looked at the rainbow in its shimmering stripes of violet, blue, and green, and yellow, and orange, and red. Then he looked at the fool. "All right, I'm willing," he said. "Come on." He stepped up on the coloured path. "It holds!" cried the king delightedly, and he ran swiftly up the rainbow, his train gathered in his hand. "I'm the king of the castle," he sang triumphantly. "And I'm the dirty rascal," called the fool, running after him. "But it's impossible," said the Lord High Chancellor, gasping. The chief professor laughed and swallowed another strawberry. How can anything that truly happens be impossible? He inquired. But it is. It must be. It's against all laws. The face of the Lord High Chancellor was purple with anger. A cry burst from the Queen. "Oh, Ethelbert, come back," she implored. "I don't mind how foolish you are, if only you'll come back." The king glanced down over his shoulder and shook his head. The fool laughed loudly. Up and up they went together, steadily climbing the rainbow. Something curved and shining fell at the queen's feet. It was the bent scepter. A moment later it was followed by the king's crown. She stretched out her arms imploringly, but the king's only answer was a song sung in his high, quavering voice. "Say goodbye, love, never cry, love, you are wise, and so am I, love." The fool, with a contemptuous flick of his hand, tossed her down a knucklebone. Then he gave the king a little push and urged him onwards. The king picked up his train and ran, and the fool pounded at his heels. On and on they went up the bright-coloured path until a cloud passed between them and the earth, and the watching queen saw them no longer. "You are wise, and so am I, love." The echo of the king's song came floating back. She heard the last thin thread of it after the king himself had disappeared. Said the Lord High Chancellor, "Such things are simply not done." But the queen sat down upon the empty throne and wept. "Ay," she cried softly, behind the screen of her hands, "my king is gone, and I am very desolate, and nothing will ever be the same again." Meanwhile, the king and the fool had reached the top of the rainbow. "What a climb!" said the king, sitting down and wrapping his cloak around him. "I think I shall sit here for a bit, perhaps a long time. You go on." "You won't be lonely?" the fool inquired. "Oh, dear, no. Why should I be? It's very quiet and pleasant up here, and I can always think, or better still, go to sleep." And as he said that, he stretched himself out upon the rainbow with his cloak under his head. The fool bent down and kissed him. "Goodbye, then, king," he said softly, "for you no longer have any need of me." He left the king quietly sleeping and went whistling down the other side of the rainbow. And from there he went wandering the world again, as he had done in the days before he met the king, singing and whistling and taking no thought for anything but the immediate moment. Sometimes he took service with other kings and high people, and sometimes he went among ordinary men living in small streets or lanes. Sometimes he would be wearing gorgeous livery, and sometimes clothes as poor as anyone ever stood up in. But no matter where he went, he brought good fortune and good luck to the house that roofed him. And we will pause there.